Once the heart of a coal industry that has been slowly dying for many years, West Virginia is now in the throes of an evolution in the resource extraction industry, which is using environmentally destructive methods like fracking to squeeze more resources, in this case, gas and oil, from an already ravaged landscape. At every stage, the energy economy and the powerful political and economic actors behind it have done whatever they can to extract as much as they can from the resource rich lands of West Virginia, while the people living and working in the state have had their lives, communities, economies, and environments perpetually at the mercy of the merciless changes and profit seeking needs of these industries. In her powerful documentary, Hard Road of Hope, director, writer, and producer Eleanor Goldfield explores the history of West Virginia's coal mining industry, the transition to gas extraction in the region, and most importantly, the effects that both have had on the lives of people living and working in the state. And we are honored to be screening this documentary for a limited time at the Real News Network. And we are even more honored to be joined today by Eleanor right now to discuss this documentary. So, Eleanor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So, there are a lot of parts of this documentary that I really want to discuss, but I think it would behoove us, right, to kind of do the basics, start at the beginning, and give viewers who are going to be seeing this documentary on the Real News Network the kind of context that they need to understand what they're about to watch, and to hear from you, like why you put this documentary together, why it was so important. So I was wondering if it's not too annoying, if I could ask you to kind of give us a little rundown of what this documentary is about and what the process of putting it together was like for you.
Sure. So the documentary is really kind of a connection of past to present, so that we can look ahead. As James Baldwin said, the past is not past, and I think that's very true. Which is why we see, for instance, that we're not allowed to teach real history in schools. Well, why? Because that's powerful history. It's powerful history that completely deconstructs the myths of America. And so to reconnect to the actual history, the lived experiences of the people who don't make it into history books, the downtrodden, not the kings and the presidents and the corporate tycoons, that's really powerful. And so the documentary is really about connecting people to a radical history, which West Virginia really has, which you don't think of offhand. When somebody says West Virginia, you don't think about, oh, I don't know, like black and white mine workers going on strike and shooting at coal barons. But that totally happened. And it happened like 100 years ago, 100 years ago this year. And the fact that people don't know about that, and that their understanding of places like West Virginia are instead based on, Trump's presidency or things like that, really goes to show you the deep power of propagandization and of amputating people from their history. So the work that folks are doing on the ground in West Virginia, that I cover somewhat in the film, is about connecting people to that radical history, and also showing people up front the effects of things like mountaintop removal and fracking. In particular with fracking, because you mentioned that an evolution, or a devolution happening in West Virginia, where coal is dying and fracking is rising. And at this crossroads, fracking is really taking over the tactics of the coal industry and kind of just replacing what the coal industry did with fracked oil and gas. And what's happening is fracking is not, it doesn't look as obvious as coal, right? When you blow the top off a mountain, that's pretty obvious. But if you do and I show this in the film too, the flyovers that I did of coal country, it's grotesque and it's obvious, these open sores on the landscape. Fracking is a bit of a different story. You see like a little frack pad here, and you see a little compressor station there. And from the air, it doesn't really look like much. And so, really highlighting the importance of looking at the destruction of fracking as not something that's a bridge fuel or not something that's so much better than coal, but that is in fact quite grotesque, just like coal, but in different ways. You know, it poisons the water, it poisons the communities, the landscape, etc., and perpetuates the oppression of people and, of course, of these ecosystems that we're a part of. So the film is about that crossroads. It's also again about the history of West Virginia and stamping out a lot of the myths that people would immediately think of when they hear the words West Virginia.
Yeah, John Denver left that radical history out of his song, didn't he? I mean, I honestly didn't know a lot about it myself until much later in life, and I wanted to kind of drill down on that. No pun intended, right? Because this is, as you said, a big focus of your work in the documentary. I think even one of the chapters of the documentary is called "The Effects of an Amputated Past," right? And there's almost a mirroring effect there, where not only are you looking at how folks living and working in West Virginia have been kind of deliberately disconnected from that radical tradition in their industries, where their forefathers and foremothers organized, fought against the bosses, stood up for themselves, but a lot of that has been kind of erased from the history books. It has been washed out of the kind of corporate propaganda about like the coal industry today, so on and so forth. And I think it's a really, really important thing that you're doing in the documentary to kind of show what the effects of losing that historical consciousness are. But at the same time, I think you also show how this industry itself, the way it's been set up, also kind of amputates or separates people from kind of community, right? It separates us from the realities on the ground in West Virginia. So I guess I wanted to ask what it was like for you to take on that task, right? Of actually, through this documentary, connecting the very things that had been systematically disconnected over the past century.
Yeah, I mean it's a powerful question and a powerful concept. It's really, I mean, you don't have to go far in the United States to see destroyed communities, right? Whether that be the Rust Belt, or whether that be, excuse me, down south in Louisiana, or out west. Everywhere you go, there are communities that have been destroyed by corporate malfeasance and the march of progress under capitalism. In West Virginia, being the third poorest state in the nation and the second most rural, these communities were really based on they were based on a sort of a commonality, a solidarity that was unfortunately based on coal and, at the advent of the state, timber as well. I mean, the state was founded basically as a resource colony during the Civil War in 1863. And so this camaraderie that could have been felt, that was initially felt, was completely destroyed by coal companies when they purposefully placed people, different parts of the coal camp. They'd bring in immigrants from Ellis Island and say, "Don't talk to the Jews; they eat babies." They'd bring black folks up from down south and they'd say, "Don't talk to them; they're savages." And they'd create these really stark separations so that community can't be built up. And these are tactics that we see today, right? The tactics may have changed and may have become a little bit more like Cirque du Soleil finesse and things like that, but the concept is still the same. Don't talk to each other, don't organize together, you should hate each other. And so this is really this is the foundation of West Virginia, the idea that people should not get together and point their ire and their anger at their situation towards the architects of their oppression, but towards each other. And of course, this means that you can't build because community is all predicated on the concept that we have some sort of shared experience. We have a shared humanity, regardless of the smaller details going on in our lives. And what could have made these places, and what did make these places really powerful communities, at the beginning of the 20th century, was then really cracked down upon, as were labor rights movements across the United States around the turn of the 20th century. But just thinking about the odds that people surmounted in organizing. I mean, black and white and immigrant mine workers coming together, didn't share a language. We're put on different parts of the coal camps. We're really oppressed, and still managed to come together and fight for some basic labor rights, like, hey, don't put 10-year-olds in the mine. um, so I think, seeing that sort of that ramp up from that initial oppression, and then seeing that ramp down because of the crackdown on labor rights. I spoke to one woman who said, scab used to be a dirty word in my home, and now it's not. Now people don't even remember what that word means. The ties to a union are not considered that important. Regulations are considered to be evil, even though, as one person in the film says, well, regulations are why you're here running your mouth, because your grandfather didn't die in a coal mine. So the framing of things that actually make people's lived experiences better and that build solidarity have turned into, things that are evil and must be fought against. And I think a really good example of that is the word redneck. Redneck, if you say that to the average person today, they'll be like, oh, that's a derogatory term for somebody who's like a Trump voter. But really, it was started during the mine wars, when mine workers would tie red bandanas around their necks as a sign of solidarity. And hey, I know which team you're on, right? You're not with the bosses. And then they went on, again, as I mentioned, to shoot at coal barons and win some basic labor rights. That is the term redneck. It's actually a really radical and leftist concept. And now the fact that we think of it in such derogatory right wing terms really speaks to the power of tearing those communities apart, and turning them into these, desolate and poverty stricken places that you see just driving through areas of West Virginia.
Yeah, I mean the visuals are I think are quite stunning, right? You start the documentary, as you said, with these aerial shots of mountains that have been blown up, right? The mountaintop removal is like really taking off the top of these mountains, and you see again those sorts of hills that John Denver famously kind of sings about. They're not what you would think they would look like, right? If you haven't been paying attention to what the coal industry has been doing there. And I think that that's another part of this kind of amputation metaphor, right? Is that those of us who do not live, like in Appalachia, just like those of us who don't live in rural areas, as we've been covering at the Real News, we often don't see, the devastation that has been wrought by the rise of industrial agriculture and factory farming. A lot of that has been almost deliberately kept out of sight so that people don't actually know or think about or care about kind of the devastation that's being wrought. Very same thing is happening, in coal country, right? A lot of that has been kept out of view, and a lot of us, frankly, haven't cared all that much about it. And I think that's why it's really important for us to kind of, have documentaries like yours that really show us front and center what that devastation looks like, both in terms of what it's done to the natural landscape, and then also what that has done to the people living in these
Mhm.
sorts of communities, right? And I wanted to ask about that because you mentioned the question of regulation, right?
Mm.
We're always hearing that yeah, these regulations, whether they're environmental, whether they're labor related, right, that these are anti-business, right? And yet, the folks who are living and working in these towns and hollers in West Virginia that you cover, they are experiencing the environmental devastation that has been wrought by the extractive industries. You look at instances of well water being poisoned. You look at the coal slurry lagoons, like and what those do to the water and to the land. I wanted to ask if you could kind of give viewers a bit of sense of like the scale of the environmental and community sort of destruction that these industries have wrought upon West Virginia and the folks living there.
Sure. So, just something that popped into my head when you were talking about, we don't see it. One of the reasons that I needed to go into a plane to get some of this footage was because you don't see it from the road. In some industries, I think in the logging industry, it's called a beauty strip. And what they do is they leave literally just like a string of trees along the highway. You'll see this along like the Pacific Coast Highway in California. Oh my God, the beautiful redwoods. And then right behind that, there is a redwood clear cut that looks like a bomb just went off. But then they keep that beauty strip because they know if this was just out there, then people might be, a bit more concerned and say, hey, I think this is messed up that you're doing this. But yeah, I mean, with regards to the destruction, I mean, in the film, one of the people that's giving kind of presentation about mountaintop removal specifically says that if you were to take all of the mountains that have been destroyed by mountaintop removal and you lined them up, that line would go from the White House in DC to San Francisco, and it would be 8/10 of a mile wide. That, I mean, I'm not good with distances, but that's just atrocious and a level of destruction. And if you look at the size of West Virginia compared to, obviously the distance from the White House to San Francisco, it doesn't even make sense how that's possible. And I think this also speaks to the aspect of communities being ripped apart. One holler, which is basically kind of like the space in between two hills. The hills and hollers is the space between. One holler called Prenter Holler, 98% of the people living there developed gallbladder disease because their water supply had been destroyed by mountaintop removal, and yet the people living there refused to say that they were anti-coal. They said, well, that coal company specifically messed up, but coal is good. And this, I mean, that's that's heavy propagandization. And one of the folks in the film says, it's become this situation where when you say no to coal, people feel like you're saying no to them. Coal has become an identity. Friends of coal, that big that big group that is really just funded by the coal industry, of course. They've created this idea that if you're anti-coal, you are anti-American, you are anti-worker, ironically enough. And one of the folks in the film makes the point. He's a UMWA member, a United Mine Workers of America union member. He says there really needs to be a Friends of Coal Miners sticker, because that's really the problem. Those are the friends that we don't have. We've got plenty of Friends of Coal, but we don't have the friends of the people who are, trampled underfoot of the coal industry, the ones who have been left behind. Trillions of dollars have been mined out of West Virginia, and yet it's the third poorest state in the nation. Riddle me that. But of course, it's not that unusual if you look at, how corporations really function. And I think the other side of this, speaking to community destruction, West Virginia is number one in the opioid crisis, the United States, an uncoveted number one position, I would say. And if you look at what triggers addiction, it's isolation, physical, mental, emotional. It's trauma, it's pain. And that is a perfect intersection of what you see in West Virginia. People are isolated physically, yes, but very much isolated mentally and emotionally. It's quite clear to them if you talk to them that politicians don't care about them. And the reason a lot of people voted for Trump was that he actually spoke to them. But there were a lot of people that voted for Bernie as well. Same reason. They feel completely left behind and they are, to be perfectly honest. And then, when the opioid epidemic started and there was this magical little pill that could get them to work longer hours, and they wouldn't be in physical pain. And then also when they got home, they wouldn't have to, consider the downward spiral of their lives. Hey, I think a lot of us would be tempted to take that special little pill. And so it's really not surprising that West Virginia holds that number one spot in terms of the opioid epidemic. If you look what's happened there, and it also really speaks to the fact that we are definitely a part of these ecosystems. We can't extricate ourselves no matter how hard we try. We are dependent upon our home places, and the simple fact that folks have to make their living off of destroying their home place. We see the same thing with people who work in big ag. they suffer a lot of mental health problems and emotional and mental pain because it's unnatural to torture animals in that way. And so I think you really see the destruction of humanity alongside the destruction of the ecosystems that we call home.
It's one of those, I think, most vital questions that many in politics in general, but including people on the left, like have not, I think, grappled with adequately. Like, what does it mean for folks to, as you said, be economically dependent on the very industries that are killing them, right? And that are killing their landscape. Like, there's a complicated knot of relationships happening there that, again, it's not like we could just sort of wave it away and say, like, oh, workers in this or that part of the country are just, they've just been duped, they don't get it. It's like, no, like, there's in these sorts of areas, this may be the only sort of like economic pathway to, like a somewhat stable
Mhm.
existence, even if it comes at the expense of, like destroying your body and destroying the landscape around you for generations to come. If you don't have a replacement for that, what are people supposed to do, right? And so as we talk about the transition to, a greener economy, right, as we talk about things like the Green New Deal, it really is important to understand where folks are coming from, in especially coal mining areas, who are resistant to this notion. Maybe not because they're entirely against the concept, but because they have every right to mistrust the
Mhm.
government and everybody else when they say, "Oh, we're going to find something for you." Right? If you are latching on that hard to the coal industry, it may also be because you've been burned many times before, and again, you have every right to kind of be mistrustful of what these developments might look like for you and your family. And I could genuinely kind of talk to you about this for days, but I don't want to keep you too long, and I wanted to kind of build on that point and ask about you know where the fracking side of
Mhm.
this comes in, right? Because one of the folks that you interview in this documentary, I think, puts it very bluntly. It says that the gas industry, oil and gas industries, have taken the coal playbook. Or I think they say coal came up with the playbook, and now gas and oil are perfecting that
Mhm.
playbook. Could you tell viewers a little bit about like what that transition has looked like, and what y'all mean when you talk about the playbook, as it were, like what coal has done that has allowed gas and oil to kind of take its place?
Yeah, I mean the playbook is vast, but it's everything from mineral rights versus surface rights, which, for instance, it's a distinction which is total BS. But welcome to corporate America. It basically severs the literal surface of the land from the minerals below, like the money pot, basically. And this happened with coal too. People would go on to folks' farms in the early 20th century and say, "Hey, look, we'll get you, a new rifle to hunt with. We'll get your wife a sewing machine, etc., etc. Just sign here, and you don't have to do anything. Like you won't even notice us, right?" And that, of course, that's not true. But these were tactics that were happening 120 years ago, and they're happening still with horizontal drilling. Okay, well, no, we don't need your property. It's cool. We'll just drill here, and then we'll go into your property and steal all of the minerals that are underneath your property. And of course, that affects that property. The water poisoning, the release of fracking chemicals. I spoke to a couple of people that just have trees falling over as if they were in a storm, but it's like a perfectly normal day. They've got animals dying and plants dying without any explanation. And of course, the explanation is fracking, but you're not going to see that fracking company talking about it. And similar tactics in the same interview when I was speaking to these folks, they had complained to the fracking company, and then the fracking company says, "Okay, well, look, here's a list of chemicals that we're gonna that are involved in fracking, so we'll come and test your water." They get the test results from the water test back, and not one of those chemicals were tested for. They tested for completely different chemicals. But then they get to say, we tested your water and it's fine. Same thing with a compressor station, which is horrifically loud. They complained about that, so they turned the compressor station off, brought a guy out with a noise meter, did a test, and then left, and then turned the compressor station back on and said, "Well, the test says it's quiet." So it's these kind of tactics that allow companies to check boxes. For instance, there was a rather infamous doctor in country called Doctor. He was nicknamed Doctor No, because he worked for the coal companies and he would see folks that would come in with black lung, but he would just continuously say, "No, you don't have black lung." Why? Because then we don't have to pay for it. So people were dying in agony, all the while having to pay out of pocket for it because the coal company refused to admit that they actually had black lung. But hey, we allowed you to go see that doctor, so we get to check that box. It's a list of tactics that are, predicated on bolstering the bottom line and oppressing as many people as possible. Just, finding that balance. We will oppress you enough until you fight back enough, then we'll back off a little bit. This sort of push and pull that we've been seeing since the advent of capitalism, really. And fracking is doing a great job of uplifting that. I also saw a place in central West Virginia. They had built an Olympic style track for a high school that had like 400 people in it. Why? Because they wanted to say, "Hey, this is what fracking gives you." And it's unfortunate, but kids come out of that high school and they say, "Well, do I want to work at dollar store, or what do I want to get paid, $70,000 working for a fracking company? And then I'll just continue to make more money." So as you noted, the choices that people are faced with are not really choices. And in order to actually, create some sort of meaningful shift, there has to be something to shift towards. And even the UMWA, again, the mine workers union, released a statement a couple months ago that said that they want a just transition. This is a mine workers union. And even they are like, "We see the writing on the wall. There's no coal left. We are going to have to find something to do with the people who are in these regions." And so I think it's very telling that people want to move towards these jobs, and it's really just the industries that are making it impossible. So yeah, even even a mine workers union sees the writing on the wall, and one of the mine workers I spoke to likened it to, just trying to get that last bit of peanut butter out of a jar. The coal is gone. We have to move on whether we like it or not. Even Trump couldn't save coal, and he really wanted to. So I think it's very, very indicative of a shift that's happening amongst people in that area. And fracking is, of course, doing its best to ensure that people don't make a shift to actual sustainable options, but towards something like fracking. But again, people on the ground are wary of it. At the same time, they understand that, look, if nobody's on our side, if we are a throwaway state of throwaway people, then I have to take this job because it's either that or starve, and that's not really a choice. And so this is also something I think that's very important for, in particular, white leftist organizers. Go to these poor white areas and don't talk down to people. Don't go in there and be like, "Let me explain climate change," or "Let me explain cap." Don't be like that. No one wants to be talked to like they're an idiot. Uh, Go to these places and say, "What do you need?" "Oh, you need healthcare. You need a stable income, and so that your family is taken care of." Cool. Let's talk about this. How can we facilitate this? How can we manifest this? These are the conversations that need to be had, and understanding that these predominantly poor white areas are perfect for groups like the KKK, and perfect for groups that tell people that their problems are, immigrants and women and black folks and people of color. But our job as white organizers and as white, media makers, I think it's very important to uplift these stories and talk about a radical past that can and is part of a radical present, that we can be in solidarity with as we work to create a radical future.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that sounds like as good of a ending point as any, and hopefully it encourages everyone watching to go check out Eleanor's powerful documentary, which is called "The Hard Road of Hope," which we are honored to be screening here at the Real News for a limited time. So go check that out. Follow Eleanor's work. And take heed of all that she just said. So, Eleanor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
This is Maximilian Alvarez for the Real News Network. Thank you so much for watching. And please go to therealnews.com/support and become a monthly sustainer of our work. Right now, we love and need and appreciate all of your help. Thanks so much.